Merry Christmas! This is your favorite Christmas elf, Gordo, and it's that time of the year again. Time for another one of my Christmas tapes. But before I get started this year, there's something I'd like to get off my chest. Now, ever since I started making these tapes, there's one question that I've been asked, I don't know, at least 1,000,000 times, and that is whether or not I really know Santa Claus. 9 years of making these tapes, and people still have to ask if I really know him. It seems that even after all these years, some of you still don't believe my stories, and even a few of you still don't even believe in Santa Claus. In fact, just last week, someone had the nerve to tell me that I couldn't possibly know Santa because he's not real. Can you believe that? Santa Claus, not real. Well, the truth is, I do know Santa Claus, and he is real. And to anyone who goes around spreading rumors like that, I can only say, you better watch out, because the elves are out there writing down every word you say, and you may not have a very Merry Christmas, if you know what I mean. Now, as most of you probably already know, every summer on my vacation, I go to the North Pole to do a little trout fishing and visit with Santa Claus. And besides being a great fishing trip, it gives me a chance to relax and just hang out with Santa and the elves. It also gives me a chance to meet some of his other friends, and as I'm sure you can imagine, Santa has quite a few unusual friends. There's elves and reindeer and snowmen, and of course yours truly. But there's also quite a few others who I've had the pleasure of meeting. And I mention this only because this year's story involves two of Santa's friends who over the years have also become good friends of mine, Penguin Pete and his ever-present faithful sidekick, Walrus Willie. Now, when I said that Santa Claus had unusual friends, I wasn't referring to Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie. I'd have to say they're probably beyond unusual. But I don't mean that in a bad way. In fact, you couldn't find two better friends if you tried. They're just a little different. And since this year's story was actually told to me by Penguin Pete, perhaps I'd better start by telling you a little bit about them. Now, on the surface, they would appear to be your average, everyday penguin and walrus. Not cartoon character, stuffed animal types, but a real-live penguin and a real-live walrus. But with one big difference. Through some strange wrinkle of nature, Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie can talk. And I don't mean they can just talk about everyday things like how are you and great weather we're having. I mean they can talk about things that even I don't understand. Why, they both make Albert Einstein look like Albert Airhead. In fact, Penguin Pete is a walking, talking encyclopedia. That's because there's never been a book written that Pete hasn't read. He's read them all, from fiction to nonfiction, from dictionaries to phone books. And Pete loves to talk. Give him an audience, which, by the way, he usually has due to the fact that talking penguins are somewhat rare, and he can talk for hours. Willie, on the other hand, while he can talk just as well as Penguin Pete, is more the quiet type. He only talks when he thinks something is worth saying. In fact, I've come to think of Willie as being the philosopher of the two. In addition to being smart, Pete and Willie, like myself, are world travelers and adventurers. They've been places you can't even imagine. And like Santa himself, they seem to exist outside of time. In other words, they've been around for as long as anyone can remember. And now you think I have some stories to tell. Penguin Pete could talk for a whole year and never run out of stories. So when I ran into them at Santa's this past summer, a little Christmas tree light came on somewhere in my head. I said to myself, I'm always looking for stories for my Christmas tape. Why not tell one of Pete's stories? And that's just what I'm going to do. So without any further delay, it's time to gather up the kids, put another log on the fire, and pour yourself a glass of your favorite Christmas cheer. Now turn up the volume and settle back, because in digital stereo sound, this is my Christmas card. It was the week before Christmas, and as usual, Santa's workshop was in high gear. Now, it was one of those years when Christmas just seems to sneak up on you. And believe it or not, it had even snuck up on Santa Claus. Well, that's not to say he doesn't work hard all year to have everything ready in time for Christmas. It's just that sometimes, well, it's Christmas before you know it. and so Santa and the elves were having to work around the clock to get all the toys finished. In fact, they were working so hard that they managed to overlook one very important detail. Santa didn't have a Christmas tree. Now, usually this was a job that the elves took care of, and Santa never was sure where the tree came from every year, but it always turned out to be the nicest tree in the entire world. But this year, they were just too busy, and he couldn't spare a single elf to go looking for a tree. So Santa decided he was going to have to ask someone to find a tree for him, a friend he could count on, and he knew just who to call: Penguin Pete. It was just 2 days before Christmas when Pete and Willie arrived at the North Pole, having received an urgent message from Santa Claus.
Ho, 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 ho! Pete and Willie, Merry Christmas to you. It's so good of you to come so quickly.
What's up, Santa? We came as soon as we got your message.
I need your help, Pete. I'm desperate. Notice anything missing around here?
Well, now that you mention it, there does seem to be a noticeable lack of the traditional Yuletide ambience. In other words...
I don't have a Christmas tree.
You don't have a Christmas tree.
Well, we've just been so busy we haven't had time to find one. Do you think you could help me? I don't know where the elves get the tree, but I figure you're bound to know of some places.
Well, say no more, Santa. We would consider it an honor to obtain a tree for your esteemed workshop, and I know just the place to look.
Oh?
I have just done a study on the availability of spruce trees worldwide.
Ho, 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 ho. I knew I could count on you. And when you get back, won't you please join us for Christmas dinner?
It would be our pleasure, Santa. And don't you worry about the tree. We'll have you one here by tomorrow.
Now, if you boys will excuse me, I have to get back to work on all those toys. They need to be ready by tomorrow. Oh, ho, 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 ho.
You worry about the toys, Santa, and leave the tree to Willie and I.
I can't thank you boys enough.
Better saddle up some reindeer, Willie. It looks like we're off on another adventure.
You're the man, Daddy-O. Where to now?
A small town known for growing the finest Christmas trees in the world.
You mean Snow Falls?
That's correct, Willie. We're headed for Snow Falls.
Snow Falls, a sleepy little town that just happens to grow some of the finest Christmas trees known to man, and possibly one of the best-kept secrets in the whole world. But believe it or not, you've seen this place so many times that you'd recognize it faster than the nose on a red-nosed reindeer. You see, Snow Falls is that little snow-covered town pictured on the front of just about every Christmas card that you receive. In fact, I'll bet if you went and looked through your Christmas cards right now, you'd find at least a half a dozen pictures of Snow Falls. Now, when Pete and Willie arrived, Snow Falls looked just like it always looks, sort of like a Norman Rockwell painting of Christmas in Connecticut. A blanket of new fallen snow covered the entire town, and you could almost feel the spirit of Christmas in the air. As they walked down Main Street, the warm glow of Christmas seemed to almost spill out of every house into the street. Well, there were lights and wreaths and ornaments of every size, shape, and color, and most houses had a Christmas tree growing right in the front yard. It was just like walking into a Christmas card. But as they came to the last house, Pete and Willie were surprised to find a different scene. Like all the other houses, there was a Christmas tree growing in the front yard. In fact, probably the most magnificent tree on the whole street. But this house and this tree looked strangely out of place with the other houses in Snow Falls. Here there were no decorations, and for that matter, no sign of any life at all. It was dark and cold and looked completely deserted. Nevertheless, Pete decided that this was the perfect Christmas tree for Santa Claus. Well, needless to say, the town of Snow Falls wasn't quite ready for the likes of Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie. Not that any town can ever really be prepared for a penguin and a walrus to come walking down Main Street looking for a Christmas tree. Even in Snow Falls, that's pretty unusual. And as Pete and Willie walked down the street, they were attracting quite a crowd. Not that you can blame the good citizens of Snow Falls for being a bit startled by the sight of Pete and Willie. Now, I should probably tell you so you can get a picture in your mind that Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie don't wear any clothes, other than their normal penguin and walrus suits, which looks just fine on them and which is what you'd expect. But Pete also wears a pair of little round spectacles that makes him look like a cross between a penguin and a librarian. And of course Willie is never seen without his red beret, which coupled with his walrus mustache makes him look like some kind of French beatnik artist. But if the mere sight of Pete and Willie was too much for these good people, then you can only imagine how they reacted when Pete actually spoke.
Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. I was wondering if I might inquire who owns this house with such a fine specimen of a tree in the yard.
Hey, someone get the police.
That bud can talk.
He's so cute.
Oh, yeah, that's real cute.
A spruce tree, I believe, which is a common name for the genus Picea, which includes roughly 40 species of coniferous trees. Spruce trees were once thought to be related to fir trees, from which they differ by having pendulous cones, persistent woody leaf bases, and 4 angled leaves, scattered and pointed in every direction. And as fine a Christmas tree as I have ever seen.
This house belongs to my uncle, Mr. B.A. Humbug. I call him Uncle Ba.
I see. And who might you be?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name's Holly. Holly Mistletoe.
Very pleased to make your acquaintance, Miss Mistletoe.
Oh, please, call me Holly.
Very well, Holly. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Penguin Pete, and my erstwhile companion here is the Honorable Walrus Willie. We are looking for a Christmas tree, and while I wouldn't want to take someone else's tree, I thought that since this house looks so dark and undecorated, that perhaps the owner would consent to part with the tree.
I don't think Uncle Ba would let anyone use this tree for a Christmas tree.
Perhaps I should add that this tree isn't for myself. It's for Santa Claus.
Oh, my gosh. You know Santa Claus?
Yes. Santa sent Willie and myself to find a Christmas tree for his house at the North Pole.
Oh, my! But my uncle would never give you this tree then. You see, Uncle Ba doesn't believe in Christmas or Santa Claus or anything like that. But I do.
Well, perhaps I should talk to your uncle.
Well, I can take you to him, but I don't know if that's a good idea. I mean, after all, you're a penguin, and that may be a little too much for Uncle Ba.
Word was spreading quickly through the town about Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie. As usual, they were attracting quite a crowd, and people were asking Pete all kinds of questions, especially since he claimed to know Santa Claus. I mean, a talking penguin on a mission from Santa Claus is bound to attract some attention, and no one was more attracted than Holly Mistletoe. If it had been up to her, she would have given Pete her uncle's tree in a heartbeat, maybe faster. Well, you could tell by the way she stood there talking to Pete that she was more than a little impressed by his knowledge of spruce trees. But as much as Pete would have loved to stay and visit with Holly, he and Willie were on a mission, and there wasn't a lot of time for socializing. Unfortunately, if Penguin Pete thought this spruce tree was the perfect Christmas tree, it would be one of the few times he was ever wrong. You see, this tree had a flaw. It belonged to B.A. Humbug, Uncle Ba as Holly liked to call him. And that was one very big flaw. Now, no one in Snow Falls was sure whether it was life-imitating art or just pure coincidence that B.A. Humbug lived up so well to his famous name. He was the meanest, most ill-humored man not only in Snow Falls, but anywhere. People in town did their best to avoid him, but that wasn't necessarily easy, because you see, B.A. Humbug owned most of the town. He owned the bank, the grocery, he had himself appointed police chief, and he even owned the Snow Falls Zoo. And everyone knew that the only person worse than B.A. Humbug was B.A. Humbug at Christmas time. That's when he really lived up to his name. So it was probably only wishful thinking on Penguin Pete's part that B.A. Humbug would give him the tree out of his yard for Santa Claus. But the only way to find out was to ask him, and that meant meeting him. And that opportunity was about to take place sooner than Pete thought. Now, news travels fast in a town like Snow Falls, especially news about a talking penguin on a mission from Santa Claus wanting to cut down a tree in the front yard of the meanest man in town. So it wasn't long before B.A. was on his way home to find out what was going on. Naturally, he didn't believe that a penguin could talk, so he merely assumed that someone was playing a clever trick on him. But B.A. did not like having his busy schedule interrupted, And being Christmas and all, he was not in a good mood. Someone was going to have to pay for this.
So there we were, Santa, Rudolph, and myself, with a sleigh full of toys stuck in a 12-foot snowdrift. So I said to Santa, what we need to do is fashion a hydraulic lift and slowly raise your sleigh out of the snow.
Oh, Pete, how do you know all these things? You're so smart.
What is going on here?
Oh, Uncle Bob, it's so exciting. This is Penguin Pete. He knows Santa Claus, and he can talk and everything. Talk to him, and you'll see there really is a Santa Claus.
There's no Santa Claus, and there's no such thing as talking animals, Holly. Can't you see you've fallen victim to someone's tasteless prank? These are animals that someone let out of my zoo. I've already notified Animal Control, and they're sending someone to pick them up.
Not the dog catcher, Uncle Bob.
Excuse me, sir. Allow me to introduce myself. My name is Penguin Pete, and this is my traveling companion, Walrus Willie.
You see, Uncle Bob, he can talk.
Rubbish! It's some clever trick of ventriloquism.
I can assure you, sir, that I have been called many things, but never a ventriloquist. Now, as I was telling your lovely niece, Willie and I were commissioned by Santa Claus to find the North Pole Christmas...
You call for rest, boss? Yes, these animals have somehow gotten out of their cages at the zoo. I want them taken back immediately. And be careful. They are wild animals and could be dangerous. Especially that... What is that? A walrus? This is the ugliest animal I've ever seen.
Yeah? Well, you ain't the coolest looking dude on Earth either, Daddy-O.
This is a mistake. We're not from your zoo, and we are certainly not dangerous.
Say, boss, you didn't tell us that they could talk.
They can't talk. It's some kind of trick. Now get that net over them and take them back to the zoo.
Uncle Bob, no!
Please, sir. Hey, watch out with that thing. Someone could get hurt.
Well, this certainly was a snowfly in the Christmas ointment. Pete and Willie captured and carried off to the Snow Falls Zoo, and Santa Claus without a Christmas tree, and just 2 days before Christmas. What else could go wrong? Now, B.A. Humbug was a lot of things, but he wasn't dumb, and he knew all along that Pete and Willie hadn't escaped from his zoo. He, of course, knew this because his zoo didn't have any penguins or walruses. Truth is, he didn't have any idea where they had come from, and even though he had heard them himself, he certainly wasn't going to accept that Pete and Willie could actually talk. Nor did he want the people of Snow Falls, especially his niece Holly, believing that animals could talk. I mean, it just wasn't a good thing. Besides, if he admitted that they could talk, he would have to admit that they knew Santa Claus, which would mean that he would have to admit that Santa Claus actually existed, and he could never do that. No, it was better if he just locked them up in his zoo and lost the key, or so he thought. Now, of course, Penguin Pete had been in worse predicaments than this. In fact, on most of their adventures, he and Willie found themselves in life-threatening situations, and things always seemed to work themselves out, so at least this current dilemma wasn't life-threatening. But he did hate to let his friend Santa down. Now, Pete knew that there had to be a way out of this, but he would just have to wait until it presented itself. Until then, he had no choice but to settle in and prepare to spend a quiet first night in his new home at the Snow Falls Zoo. But it wasn't destined to work out that way. By evening, the zoo was swamped with people wanting to see the talking penguin and walrus. Everyone who hadn't seen and heard Pete and Willie on Main Street that afternoon wanted to see and hear them now. Pete, of course, never one to shy away from an audience, was giving a lecture on the meteorological conditions at the North Pole.
And so, since the prevailing south winds at the North Pole create a high-pressure ridge, a dome of cold air...
B.A. Humbug was so mad he was beside himself. Now, you might think that this huge crowd at the zoo would make him a happy man. And in fact, when he first heard about it, you could almost see dollar signs in his eyes, except for two things. First of all, the zoo was closed for the day, being as how it was after 6 o'clock, and there was no one collecting admission at the gate. So while it was the largest crowd in the history of the zoo, it was also the largest free crowd in the history of the zoo. Secondly, at least half the people in the crowd, led by his own dear niece Holly Mistletoe, were protesting his handling of Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie, and were threatening a Christmas sit-in at the zoo. An army of news media had descended upon the zoo from nowhere, and the protesters were currently singing Silent Night, bathed in the glare of TV lights. The whole town was in an uproar. Those citizens not mad at him for locking up Pete and Willie were upset because the circus atmosphere of the event was threatening to overshadow Christmas in this quiet little town. It turned out to be the longest night of B.A. Humbug's life. By Christmas Eve morning, the zoo was total chaos, and B.A. Humbug's world was collapsing around him. People from all over were flocking to see Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie, and a growing number of them were demanding their release. The zoo was surrounded by TV trucks with their satellite dishes aimed skyward, and while he had so far managed to keep the TV cameras out of the new Arctic animal's habitat, B.A. knew it was only a matter of time before the talking penguin who claimed to know Santa Claus was giving interviews on CNN and all the other networks. Then the whole world would think that he was unfairly keeping an intelligent being in a cage at the Snow Falls Zoo. Now that's not to say that every animal in every cage at every zoo isn't an intelligent being, but I won't get into that now or we'd never finish our story. Anyway, suffice it to say that B.A. knew that he wasn't going to be able to keep Pete and Willie locked up much longer. But to let them go would be the same as admitting that they really could talk. And that would mean that B.A. Humbug would have to admit that he was wrong. By afternoon, B.A. Humbug was really on the spot. The townspeople were demanding an investigation. His own niece Holly wouldn't even talk to him, and the animal rights people were wanting him skinned alive publicly. People were calling him all kinds of things. The Snow Falls Gazette called him the local Scrooge, while the bubble-headed newswoman on CNN called him mean and cruel. Mean and cruel, and coming from a total stranger like her. This stung even someone like B.A. Humbug. He had never thought of himself as mean or cruel. Fact is, he'd never understood why people didn't like him, but he had never thought it was because he was mean and cruel. Well, maybe if he let the talking penguin and his overstuffed friend go, they wouldn't think of him this way. They still wouldn't like him, he was sure of that, but at least they might stop calling him mean and cruel. So after giving the matter some serious thought, B.A. Humbug decided to release Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie. And he was forced to finally admit that they really could talk. And while he still couldn't understand how something like that could happen, he had heard them with his own 2 ears. So he sent his assistant to get Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie and bring them to his office. He also sent someone to get Holly.
Now, let's get one thing straight. I don't know where you've come from or why you've decided to come here, but I don't think it's right that animals should talk. This used to be a quiet little town before you came. Now look at it. Reporters everywhere, protesters, every lunatic in the whole world seems to have shown up at my doorstep.
Sir, we just came here looking for a Christmas tree for Santa Claus, not to cause trouble for you or your town.
There you go again about this Santa Claus character. What right does he have, if he exists, of sending you to my town, of wanting a tree out of my yard? What's he ever given me?
Well, to start with, how would you know whether or not he's ever given you anything if you don't believe in him?
Yeah, Uncle Bob, and you've always gone around bad-mouthing him. Why should he give you anything?
Now wait, Holly. You're both missing the point here. Christmas was never supposed to be about what someone gives you anyway. It's about what you give to someone else.
Enough of this. I didn't bring you here to debate Christmas. I've decided to let you go.
Oh, thank you, Uncle Bob.
Not because of Santa Claus or any other Christmas nonsense, but because I believe it would be better for all of us if you two leave Snow Falls immediately.
Say no more. We're on our way.
Hey, thanks, Pop. Hey, by the way, you got some cool digs around here. Very happening.
So Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie emerged from the front gates of the zoo free, while B.A. left by a back door. You see, it's never easy for someone as stubborn as B.A. Humbug to admit that they've been wrong. So he went straight to his house and locked the door and closed all the curtains. The matter was over with, and he just wanted to be left alone. But of course we all know that the story can't end here. Now maybe it was because of the whole Penguin Pete thing. Or maybe it was just because it was Christmas. But a funny thing began to happen. One by one, the townspeople began to come by to say Merry Christmas to B.A. Humbug. And many of them brought things, too. Mrs. Campbell brought some of her homemade soup, and Mrs. Smith brought an apple pie. He didn't know what to think. No one had ever given him anything in his whole life. Mean old B.A. Humbug, who no one liked, who that brainless bimbo on the news had called mean and cruel, and yet people were treating him like they would any of their other neighbors at Christmas. B.A. Humbug was confused. He just couldn't understand this Christmas thing, and the more he thought about it, he realized that he had a question he wanted to ask Penguin Pete. So he left his house and nearly ran all the way down Main Street, hoping he wasn't too late. He finally caught up with Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie, along with his niece Holly at the outskirts of town.
Wait!
Uncle Bob?
As you can see, sir, we're leaving town just as you asked.
But wait, I want to ask you something.
And what, sir, would that be?
Well, you know, I was thinking about what you said earlier, about it being more important what you give people than what you get from them. And I have a question. The Santa Claus friend of yours, he's always giving people all kinds of things. I bet he gets a lot of things back.
Actually, no. Mrs. Claus knits him a sweater every year, and I'm sure the elves make him a little something. But I don't think he gets any more presents than anyone else. But it doesn't matter to him. He'd rather give than receive anyway.
Interesting. Do you know that I've never given anything to anyone?
Well, I'm sure you've had your reasons.
But you know, I'm beginning to think that maybe there's something to this whole Christmas thing. Didn't you say that you came here to find a Christmas tree for Santa Claus? Well, I want him to have the tree out of my front yard. If he's like people say, then I guess he probably deserves it.
Uncle Bob, you're so wonderful.
I think your pal Santa is all right. And you know, I'd like to meet him someday.
Well, I know he'll appreciate the tree. And you may get a chance to meet him real soon. I have a feeling he may be stopping by your house tonight.
And you and your friend Willie here are welcome in Snow Falls anytime as my guest.
And so Penguin Pete and Walrus Willie returned to the North Pole on Christmas Eve with the finest Christmas tree Santa had ever seen. Partly because it was one of the most beautiful spruce trees ever grown, and partly because of the spirit in which it was given. Back in Snow Falls, B.A. Humbug was preparing to celebrate his first Christmas ever, and he was almost like a different person. The town could hardly believe their eyes. He was actually being nice. Holly had decided to stop calling him Uncle Ba and had started calling him Uncle Bob, which was actually what the B in B.A. stood for. And together they decided to host a dinner on Christmas Day for the entire town, complete with presents for everyone. But the biggest change in him was that for the first time in his life, he believed in Santa Claus. And that Christmas Eve night, as he lay in his bed listening for the sound of reindeer on his roof, B.A., or Uncle Bob, thought about a penguin named Pete and a walrus named Willie, and a world in which animals can talk and Santa Claus really exists. And he decided that he would never again not believe in something just because he couldn't understand it. Well, there you have it, another Christmas adventure. And what more could you expect from a story told by a penguin? Now I know that there are a lot of you who aren't going to believe that this story actually came from a talking penguin. In fact, most of you will believe that I made it all up myself. Well, I can just hear the messages on my answering machine now. Come on, Gordo, first you tell us that you actually know Santa Claus, and now you want us to believe that you hang out with talking penguins. Well, I guess I should probably expect the dog catcher with the net to come looking for me, but you know what? There was a real message in that story. A message that Penguin Pete would know a lot about because he has to face it every day. And that message is about believing. Now, most people probably don't really believe that penguins can talk. Some people, like old Uncle Bob, couldn't even believe it when they heard it with their own ears. But it really goes back to what I was saying at the beginning of this tape about believing in Santa Claus. Now, it's easy for me to believe in him because I know him. But it's much harder for people who've never met him to believe that he really exists. And of course, there's always going to be some people who would refuse to believe in him even if they saw him slide down their chimney on Christmas Eve. But my hat goes off to those people who can believe in Santa Claus even though they've never seen him. They're the true visionaries. You know, there's a lot of things in this world that require that kind of faith. Well, I know people who go through life thinking that if they can't see something, it doesn't exist. I met an ostrich once who told me that if she stuck her head in the sand every time she felt threatened, the danger would just go away. Unfortunately, many of us deal with the problems of this world that way. And the problems haven't gone away yet. But this Christmas, believe in Santa Claus. Believe that animals can talk. Believe in a better world. But believe in the unbelievable. Believe in miracles, because they really exist. After all, that is what Christmas is all about, isn't it? Merry Christmas to all, and to all, good night.